When my husband tossed a $100,000 check onto my counter, he thought he was buying my life's work to impress his billionaire mistress. He expected tears. He expected me to surrender. He had absolutely no idea that his handwritten memo line was actually a legally binding confession to corporate espionage. And he certainly didn't know that my quiet signature was the final trigger to an air-gapped digital trap, one that would completely vaporize his career and send his mistress to federal prison in exactly 72 hours. If you're listening to this story right now, where are you from and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Gavin was gone, his hurried footsteps echoing down the hallway as he rushed back to whatever cheap illusion of power he was currently chasing. I stood alone in the silence of my kitchen. I didn't throw a plate. I didn't break down in tears. I simply walked over to the espresso machine and began grinding fresh, dark roast beans. The mechanical hum was comforting. Gavin honestly believed he had just outsmarted me. He believed that because we shared a legal marriage certificate, he had some inherent right to the contents of my mind. He assumed the marriage meant my assets were his assets. What he conveniently forgot, or perhaps never bothered to fully understand, was the prenuptial agreement we had both signed 7 years ago. It was a very dry, very meticulous document. It explicitly stated that any intellectual property generated prior to and during the marriage, specifically relating to biological extraction processes, belonged solely to a private, irrevocable trust. He had eagerly signed away his rights to it in exchange for a guaranteed monthly living allowance. He traded an empire for a weekly paycheck. Gavin was merely an administrative manager. His entire professional life revolved around ordering printer toner, scheduling facility maintenance, and pretending to understand the scientific journals left in the corporate break room. He looked at my chemical formulas and saw only meaningless alphabet soup. He saw no value in the long nights, the endless trials, the quiet dedication. He only saw a shortcut to a promotion. I poured the rich, dark espresso into a ceramic mug. The aroma filled the room, grounding me. I took a slow sip. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked past the marble counter, leaving the photocopy of his blue ink check sitting there. That little piece of paper was now a legally binding document, proving his intent to sell stolen intellectual property. I moved toward the back of the house, stopping in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelf in my study. I reached behind a leather-bound copy of a medical journal and pressed a hidden biometric scanner. The shelf clicked, releasing a heavy hydraulic lock, and swung open silently. A cool draft of heavily filtered air rushed out to greet me. I descended the narrow, illuminated concrete stairs. The temperature dropped exactly 4 degrees. At the bottom, a reinforced steel door required dual-factor authentication. I looked into the retinal scanner. The door slid open, revealing my true sanctuary, the server room. Row upon row of matte black server racks hummed with quiet, immense power. This was an air-gapped system. It was entirely severed from the outside internet, a digital fortress designed to protect data that was far more valuable than gold. I set my coffee mug down on a stainless steel console and tapped the spacebar on the main terminal. The screen woke up, bathing the dark room in a sharp blue light. I wasn't just a quiet housewife playing with test tubes. I was the architect of a system that was about to dismantle his entire existence. A red alert blinked steadily in the corner of the monitor. Someone had triggered a perimeter alarm on the secondary data cluster. The hunt had officially begun. The server room was only the brain of the operation. The beating heart lay just beyond the next set of reinforced doors. I walked through a short decontamination corridor, the harsh ultraviolet lights sterilizing the air around me. When the heavy airtight seal released, I stepped into the main laboratory. It was a breathtaking contrast to the dilapidated, rust-stained exterior of the old medical warehouse sitting above ground on the outskirts of Boston. Up there, people saw peeling paint, broken asphalt, and forgotten industrial decay. Down here, 30 feet below the earth, it was a pristine $20 million eco-brutalist masterpiece. The walls were raw, sealed concrete, designed to minimize particulate shedding. The lighting was entirely shadowless, casting a sterile, surgical glow over rows of custom-built, stainless steel workstations. This was a fully certified, mini-good manufacturing practice clean room. It was an environment stricter than most hospital operating theatres. I walked past the ultra-low temperature freezers, their digital displays glowing a steady negative 80 degrees Celsius. Inside those thick, insulated walls rested thousands of highly stable plasma samples. Each vial represented a potential breakthrough, a tiny fragment of a puzzle I had spent a decade trying to solve. Gavin thought I was simply dabbling in amateur chemistry. He had absolutely no concept of the scale, the precision, or the sheer capital required to maintain a facility like this. I didn't fund this with my husband's meager administrative salary. Every single piece of equipment, from the microscopic pipettes to the massive industrial air handlers, was purchased through a blind, irrevocable trust established by my late grandfather. The money was completely untraceable to my marriage. It was a massive financial moat that Gavin could never cross, no matter how desperately he tried to claim a stake in my life. I approached the center console. This was the crown jewel of the facility, the biological extraction unit. It wasn't a standard machine you could order from a catalogue. I had designed the schematic myself, piecing together components from aerospace contractors and deep-sea engineering firms. It was the only device on the planet capable of separating the specific plasma proteins without destroying their delicate molecular structure. Without this machine, the chemical formula was completely useless. The plasma proteins required a highly specific centrifugal gradient, a precise manipulation of pressure and temperature that could not be replicated by standard laboratory equipment. It was a symphony of physics and biology. Sierra, with all her corporate millions, thought she could simply read a recipe and bake the cake. She was dangerously arrogant. I tapped the tablet mounted on the side of the machine. The screen flickered, displaying the overnight diagnostic logs. Everything was running at optimal efficiency. Suddenly, a notification pinged on the secure internal network. It was an encrypted message from my logistics broker. The text was short, dry, and incredibly satisfying. Centrifuge component 3 of 3, delivered and secured at the secondary site. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. I smiled in the quiet hum of the lab. My fortress was complete. I returned to the server room and pulled up the security dashboard. The blinking red light was an anomaly on a secondary, non-critical data cluster. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair and began typing. My fingers moved across the keyboard with methodical precision. I wasn't panicked. I was simply curious. I opened the firewall logs to trace the origin of the breach. It hadn't been a sophisticated cyber attack. There was no magic hacking, no brute force algorithm tearing through my encryption. It was something far more mundane and far more pathetic. The breach was internal. It was a physical download. The log showed that at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, someone had inserted an encrypted flash drive directly into an access terminal in my upstairs home office. The user identification code was unmistakable. It was Gavin's card. My husband had crept out of bed while I was sleeping, bypassed the basic visual lock on my personal computer, and copied files. He had downloaded 400 pages of chemical equations and raw data outputs. He thought he had stolen the Holy Grail. He thought he possessed the blueprint for the brain cancer therapeutic. But I didn't stop at the download log. I tracked the digital fingerprint of the files. I had embedded an invisible, trackable metadata signature into every single document on that drive. I watched the data packet travel. 2 hours later, those files were opened, but they weren't opened on Gavin's cheap laptop. The MAC address of the receiving machine was registered to a secure corporate network. I ran a quick diagnostic on the IP address. The text populated on my screen in stark, unforgiving letters. Apex Global Pharmaceuticals. The files were sitting on a machine inside the executive suite. Sierra. Gavin wasn't just a thief. He was a courier for the most ruthless CEO in the biotech industry. Sierra was a woman known for acquiring small startups, gutting them for their intellectual property, and burying the founders in endless litigation. She wanted my plasma research, and she was using my husband to get it. I dug deeper into the network log, accessing the temporary cache of the corporate server. I wanted to see how Sierra categorized the incoming data. I found the directory. Sierra hadn't saved the files under Gavin's name. She hadn't labeled him as a lead researcher or a valuable partner. She had created a tiny, insignificant subfolder for his uploads. I read the title of the folder out loud to the empty room. Administrative access. That was all he was to her. He was just a keycard. He was a disposable tool. Gavin was betraying his marriage, risking federal prison, and selling his soul, all for a woman who viewed him as a minor, clerical utility. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The pieces were aligning perfectly. Let them read the schematics. Let Sierra pore over the pages with her team of highly paid, utterly uninspired corporate chemists. Let them think they had bypassed a decade of grueling clinical trials. They were about to step onto a minefield of their own making, and they were entirely blindfolded. I closed the terminal window. Let them read the files. To understand how Gavin could be so breathtakingly arrogant, you have to understand the foundation of our marriage. It wasn't built on mutual respect. It was built on my quiet complicity in his mediocrity. 5 years ago, before the underground lab existed, we were renting a small, cramped commercial space. I was in the critical early stages of isolating the plasma proteins. Gavin, desperate to impress his regional manager, had invited him over for an impromptu tour. He wanted to play the role of the visionary tech husband. I had explicitly told him that the cold storage units were strictly off-limits. The temperature gradients were incredibly delicate. But Gavin never liked rules that applied to him. He wanted to show off the glowing blue LED screens and the hum of the heavy compressors. While I was in a meeting, he bypassed the secondary lock and opened the main cryogenic chamber. He just wanted to hold a vial up to the light. He dropped the tray. 12 vials of stabilized protein, representing 6 months of relentless, sleep-deprived work, shattered on the hard linoleum floor. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, completely vaporized in an instant of sheer ego. When I found him, he was on his knees, pale and shaking, trying to sweep up the toxic, ruined glass with a dustpan. He looked pathetic. He begged me not to tell the facility board. He wept, swearing that an official reprimand would destroy his administrative career. He said he would be blacklisted from the industry. And I made the worst mistake of my life. I felt pity. I logged into the inventory system and marked the batch as compromised due to a mechanical failure in the refrigeration unit. I took the blame. I absorbed the massive financial loss through my private trust. I protected his fragile, useless pride. That was the exact moment the dynamic shifted. By shielding him from the consequences of his actions, I inadvertently taught him that he was untouchable. It was interpreted as weakness. He began to gaslight me. He started telling our friends that my research was disorganized, that he had to manage my schedule just to keep me afloat. He would look at me across the dinner table and casually mention how my little science projects were draining our resources, completely ignoring the fact that his entire lifestyle was funded by my grandfather's trust. He began to rewrite history, positioning himself as the pragmatic savior of a chaotic, ungrateful scientist. He needed to belittle my genius to justify his own overwhelming inadequacy, and I had let it happen. I had normalized his toxic, parasitic behavior because it was easier than fighting a man who lived in a delusion. But pity has a very short half-life. The woman who wept over shattered glass was gone. I walked over to my secure filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a single, pristine red folder. It contained the original, unaltered incident report, the forensic truth about the broken vials, and the audit trail of the cover-up. It was a loaded weapon. The financial architecture of my life was not an accident. It was a meticulously crafted fortress, designed long before Gavin ever stepped into my world. When my grandfather passed away, he left behind a substantial estate. He didn't just leave me money. He left me a team of deeply cynical, brilliant estate attorneys. They helped me establish a blind, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a very specific legal mechanism. Once you put assets inside it, you surrender direct ownership. You cannot easily dissolve it, alter it, or take the money back. The trust becomes its own legal entity, entirely immune to personal liabilities, lawsuits, and, most importantly, divorce settlements. Gavin had absolutely no idea how it worked. He hated reading legal documents. He found the vocabulary tedious and the formatting exhausting. 7 years ago, exactly 2 weeks before our wedding, my attorneys presented Gavin with a prenuptial agreement. It was 60 pages long. It clearly stipulated that any intellectual property, particularly biological extraction methodologies developed during our marriage, would be owned exclusively by the trust. In exchange, Gavin was guaranteed a very comfortable, tax-free monthly living allowance. He didn't hire his own lawyer to review it. He didn't read past the 3rd page. He simply saw the guaranteed monthly income and eagerly signed his name on a Tuesday morning while drinking a latte. He traded a potential empire for a weekly direct deposit. He chose convenience over equity. Now, every single expense in my underground laboratory was paid for by that trust. the high-grade reagents, the liquid nitrogen, the custom centrifuge components, every receipt, every shipping manifest, and every maintenance log was issued to a corporate entity that had nothing to do with Gavin. He believed that because we shared a residential address and a bed, he owned a piece of my mind. He thought his signature on that $100,000 check would legally transfer my work to him. He was trying to sell a house he had never owned using a deed written in crayon. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out the original incorporation papers. The ink was black. The notary seal was deeply embossed into the thick parchment paper. This was my invisible shield. The trust owned it all. I didn't need to hire a private investigator to track my husband's infidelity. I didn't need to plant hidden microphones or hack into his phone. I merely needed to look at the automated toll transponder logs on our shared vehicle account. For the past 4 months, Gavin's car had been exiting the highway near the downtown financial district every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I matched those times with the itemized billing on his personal credit card. He always bought a generic black coffee at a cafe across the street from the Omni Hotel exactly 10 minutes before his meetings began. He thought he was being incredibly discreet. He thought he was living a double life as a high-powered executive involved in a glamorous corporate romance. But I knew Sierra. I knew how she operated. I had seen her corporate acquisition strategies. Sierra did not do romance. She did asset extraction. I sat in my study, reviewing the timeline. Sierra always paid for the hotel room. She never invited him to her actual home. She never took him to public dinners. She kept him entirely isolated in a sterile, temporary environment. I could perfectly visualize their interactions. Gavin, puffing out his chest, bragging about his administrative access to my lab. Sierra leaning in, pretending to be fascinated by his mediocre intellect, while subtly asking highly specific questions about my equipment vendors, my data storage protocols, and my daily schedule. She was treating him like an interactive corporate espionage manual. She was pumping him for access codes disguised as pillow talk. Gavin was too profoundly narcissistic to realize he wasn't a lover. He was a vulnerability being actively exploited. He felt powerful because a billionaire CEO was giving him attention. He didn't realize she was simply shaking a vending machine to see what loose change would fall out. I watched his car pull into the driveway through the security feed. He walked to the front door, adjusting his tie, carrying the arrogance of a man who thought he had outsmarted his quiet, boring wife. I didn't feel a single ounce of heartbreak. I only felt a clinical, overwhelming sense of pity for his absolute blindness. He was just a key. The underground lab was my sanctuary, but the true purpose of my work existed miles away, bathed in the harsh, fluorescent light of a pediatric oncology ward. I parked my car 3 blocks from the hospital to avoid being recognized by the regular staff. I walked through the side entrance, keeping my head down until I reached the restricted wing. "Doctor!" Harold was waiting for me outside, room 412. He looked older than he had a year ago. His shoulders stooped under the immense weight of his profession, but his eyes were sharp and intensely bright. He handed me a blue manila folder. I didn't open the door. I simply stood at the thick observation glass and looked inside. Noah was sitting on the edge of his hospital bed. He was 7 years old. He was entirely bald from the early rounds of traditional chemotherapy, and his skin was a fragile, translucent white. but he was holding a blue crayon, furiously colouring a picture of a spaceship. He was smiling. The latest scan came back an hour ago. Madeline. Doctor, Harold whispered, standing beside me. The tumour margin hasn't just stabilised. It has retreated by exactly 14%. The plasma protein extraction is crossing the blood-brain barrier exactly as your models predicted. Noah was patient zero in our compassionate use program. It was a perfectly legal, highly restricted clinical trial approved by an independent ethics board. The patients' identities were strictly anonymized to prevent corporate pharmaceutical scouts from poaching the data. My trust funded the entire operation quietly, bypassing the massive bureaucratic hurdles of traditional funding. I watched Noah hold up his drawing, showing it to a tired but beaming nurse. This was why the data had to remain air-gapped. This was why I lived in the shadows. If the open market knew that a functional, scalable therapeutic was this close to completion, the predators would descend. Hedge funds would aggressively short the stocks of our competitors. Corporate giants would buy out my chemical suppliers just to choke my production line. They would turn Noah's survival into a speculative asset on the Nasdaq. I placed my hand flat against the cold observation glass. I wasn't just building a company. I was guarding a fragile, precious flame against a hurricane of corporate greed. He was counting on me. My absolute refusal to deal with Sierra wasn't born out of professional jealousy. It was born in a sterile boardroom exactly 14 months ago, before I went completely underground. Doctor, Harold had desperately pitched our preliminary findings to Apex Global Pharmaceuticals. We needed an initial grant to secure the high-grade raw plasma for our very first trial. I had attended the meeting purely as a silent observer, sitting in the back row taking notes. Sierra had walked into the room wearing a pristine, tailored white suit. She didn't look at the clinical data. She didn't look at the biological models. She only looked at the projected cost-to-profit matrix. Doctor, Harold had spoken passionately about children like Noah. He talked about survival rates, about reducing human suffering, about giving desperate families a tangible fraction of hope. Sierra had listened with a perfectly blank, utterly polite expression. When he finished, the room went dead silent. Sierra tapped her designer pen against the mahogany table. Doctor, Harold, she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any human warmth. The science is charming, but the target demographic is fundamentally flawed. You are proposing an incredibly expensive extraction process for a rare pediatric condition. She leaned forward, locking eyes with the old doctor. I don't raise drug prices for fun. I simply let the market decide who gets to live. The patients you are describing are non-scalable compassion cases. There is no recurring revenue model here. We cannot justify the capital expenditure to our shareholders. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand. She dismissed thousands of lives because the math didn't trigger a stock dividend. I didn't argue. I didn't stand up and yell. I didn't throw my notebook. I simply closed my laptop, walked out of that building, and quietly activated the funds from my grandfather's trust. Sierra viewed human life as a depreciating asset. She believed that power belonged to those who controlled the capital. I decided, in that exact moment, to prove her fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. I would build the cure in the dark, and I would make sure her hands never, ever touched it. She chose the wrong enemy. I stood in the center of the subterranean clean room, staring at the massive biological extraction unit. The stainless steel gleamed under the shadowless lights. Gavin had stolen 400 pages of chemical equations and raw data models. He had handed Sierra the blueprint for the protein chain. I knew they were currently celebrating in a high-rise office, popping champagne, fully believing they had secured the cure. What neither of them understood was the fundamental reality of advanced biotechnology. A chemical formula is not a product. It is merely a concept. It is a map. But a map is completely useless if you don't have the exact custom-built vehicle required to navigate the terrain. Biotechnology isn't software. You cannot simply copy and paste a line of code and expect the program to run. The plasma proteins I worked with were incredibly volatile. If the ambient temperature fluctuated by half a degree during the separation phase, the proteins denatured. If the centrifuge spun 80 rotations per minute too fast, the molecular bonds shattered. The secret wasn't in the chemical makeup. The real value was in the trade secret, the highly specific, unwritten parameters of the manufacturing process. It was the exact sequence of thermal shocking. It was the custom filtration mesh I had designed myself. None of that information was on the files Gavin stole. Sierra possessed a list of ingredients. She did not possess the recipe, the oven, or the chef. She had stolen a highly complex chemical corpse. Her team of corporate scientists would spend the next 6 months trying to replicate my results. They would pour tens of millions of dollars into clinical trials, attempting to stabilize the plasma using standard industry protocols. And every single batch they produced would fail. It would turn into a toxic, useless sludge. They were holding a locked vault and celebrating, completely unaware that I had melted down the only key in existence. I watched the centrifuge spin down to a gentle halt. The soft mechanical click signaled a perfect extraction cycle. I smiled. Let Sierra build her corporate strategy around the stolen data. The formula was a trap. The quiet hum of the pediatric oncology ward was vastly different from the sterile silence of my underground laboratory. It was a space filled with an underlying, desperate tension. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner of Noah's room, watching the slow, rhythmic drip of his intravenous line. Doctor. Harold was reviewing the latest chart, his expression remarkably soft. The experimental plasma therapeutic was working. The aggressive cellular growth had not just paused, it was actively retreating. This was the culmination of a decade of relentless, isolated work. I had bypassed the massive, bureaucratic machinery of traditional pharmaceutical development entirely. Big Pharma required a highly specific return on investment. They needed a wide demographic, a chronic condition, and a lifetime dependency to justify the capital expenditure. Noah's condition was incredibly rare. To the corporate boardrooms of companies like Apex Global, children like Noah were considered terrible investments. I still vividly remembered Sierra's flawlessly manicured hand waving away Dr. Harold's initial grant proposal 14 months ago. She had called these children non-scalable compassion cases. She had casually stated that the market dictates who receives the privilege of survival. It was a breathtaking display of corporate sociopathy. She didn't view medicine as a tool for healing. She viewed it solely as an instrument for wealth extraction. That was the exact moment I realized my research could never exist in the open market. If I published the preliminary findings, the vultures would immediately circle. Hedge funds would aggressively purchase the supply chain for the raw materials. Competitors would file frivolous patent challenges simply to delay production while they reverse engineered the formula. The cost of the final drug would be artificially inflated to astronomical levels, completely pricing out the families who needed it most. I chose anonymity not out of modesty, but out of absolute necessity. The blind trust funded the manufacturing in my subterranean clean room. We operated under a strictly regulated compassionate use protocol, completely shielding the patients from media scrutiny and corporate predators. I looked at Noah's sleeping face. His breathing was steady and calm. This was the only metric of success that truly mattered. I didn't need a corporate press release. I didn't need a ringing bell at the stock exchange. I only needed this quiet room and the steady rhythm of a healing pulse. The most dangerous assumption a thief can make is believing that the victim is blind. I had anticipated a physical breach long before Gavin ever entertained the idea of corporate espionage. When you construct a multi-million-dollar air-gapped data fortress, you do not leave the front door unlocked. The security wasn't just about preventing external hackers. It was about managing internal vulnerability. The laboratory documentation protocol was completely proprietary. I had designed a secure document management system that tracked every single keystroke. Gavin assumed that stealing data simply meant highlighting a folder, pressing the print command, and walking away with a stack of papers. He possessed a dangerously rudimentary understanding of modern digital security. I sat at my main terminal, reviewing the audit logs from the previous week. Gavin had used his administrative access card to enter the upper office at 2 a.m. He had accessed the secondary server, the one I had intentionally populated with the raw, incomplete chemical frameworks. He had hit print. 400 pages of complex molecular diagrams were routed to the heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of the room. What Gavin failed to comprehend was that every single sheet of paper ejected from that machine was forensically unique. The system was programmed to embed an invisible, microscopic digital watermark across the margins of every printed document. It wasn't something you could see with the naked eye, but under a specific spectrum of ultraviolet light, the paper revealed a comprehensive digital footprint. The watermark contained the exact timestamp of the print job. It contained the specific MAC address of the printer. Most importantly, it contained the unique user identification code of the person who initiated the command. Gavin had essentially stamped his own signature across every single page he stole. He had placed those pages into his leather briefcase, feeling like a mastermind. He had carried a highly detailed, legally binding map of his own crime directly into Sierra's hands. He thought he was delivering a billion-dollar secret. In reality, he was delivering an airtight indictment. I watched the log entry finalize on my screen. The evidence was secured and instantly backed up to 3 separate, encrypted drives. 72 hours later, the trap snapped shut. The air-gapped system ensured that the most critical element of my research remained entirely localized. While Gavin was busy playing corporate courier with the incomplete chemical frameworks, I was focused on the actual execution. The raw formula was merely a recipe. The true value of the intellectual property resided in the manufacturing process itself. In advanced biologics, you cannot separate the product from the process. The specific temperature curves, the precise rotational force of the centrifuge, the exact duration of the cellular filtration. These were the trade secrets. They were not written down in any digital file. They existed solely in the operational memory of the customized machinery and in my own mind. Sierra's team of highly compensated chemists would look at the stolen documents and see a complete picture. They would attempt to synthesize the proteins using standard pharmaceutical equipment. They would fail catastrophically. The proteins would denature the moment they hit the wrong pressure threshold. They would produce highly toxic variants of the therapeutic. Sierra had acquired the map, but she had absolutely no idea how to read the topography. While I was calibrating the final filtration sequence in the clean room, a secure notification chimed on my encrypted communication relay. It was a message forwarded through a highly obscured proxy server. The sender was completely anonymous, but the attached files were remarkably clear. Someone inside Apex Global was getting incredibly nervous. I opened the attachment. It was an internal financial audit, discreetly compiled by someone who recognized a massive compliance violation. The spreadsheet detailed a series of substantial payments originating from a shell company controlled by Sierra. The disbursements were categorized as independent consulting fees. The recipient of these exorbitant fees was a newly registered limited liability corporation. I cross-referenced the corporate registry data. The LLC was registered to Gavin. Sierra was systematically paying my husband tens of thousands of dollars under the guise of consultancy. Gavin had no scientific background, no consulting credentials, and no legitimate reason to receive corporate funds from a pharmaceutical giant. The timeline of the payments perfectly aligned with the dates of his late-night printing sessions. The financial trail was luminous. I didn't just have evidence of theft. I had documented proof of corporate bribery. I held the leverage. Gavin's arrogance escalated in direct proportion to the balance of his hidden consulting accounts. He began walking through our home with the swagger of a conquering executive. He started criticizing the modest furniture, complaining about the quiet neighborhood, and loudly dreaming about the luxury penthouse he intended to lease in the city. He believed he was on the precipice of unimaginable wealth. He cornered me in the kitchen on a rainy Thursday evening. I was preparing a simple dinner, slicing vegetables with methodical precision. He slammed his briefcase onto the counter, invading my space. His face was flushed with manufactured authority. He demanded the master passwords for the heavily encrypted secondary servers. He claimed that my disorganized filing system was hindering a massive collaborative opportunity he was orchestrating. He stated that I was wasting his financial resources on trivial science projects. He actually threatened to cut off the household accounts, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire existence was subsidized by my trust. He demanded compliance, or he would leave me with nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him that he didn't own the house, the lab, or the equipment. I didn't point out his profound intellectual limitations. I simply looked at him, my expression perfectly neutral. The desperation in his eyes was palpable. Sierra was likely pressuring him for the missing process data, and he was failing to deliver. I wiped my hands on a towel. I picked up a small, yellow sticky note and a pen. I wrote down a complex alphanumeric string. It was a master password. I handed it to him. Gavin snatched the paper from my fingers, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face. He thought he had broken me. He thought his intimidation tactics had finally forced me into submission. He immediately turned and marched toward his home office to retrieve the remaining files. What he didn't know was that the password I gave him didn't unlock the primary data vault. It unlocked a meticulously constructed honeypot server. It was a decoy environment designed to track, log, and isolate unauthorized access. The moment he typed that sequence into his terminal, he triggered a cascading, undeniable security audit. He took the bait. I sat in the dim light of the server room, watching the security protocols execute flawlessly. Gavin was currently trapped in the honeypot, downloading gigabytes of generated garbage data, fully convinced he was securing his future. But my attention was drawn to the muted television monitor mounted on the far wall. The financial news network was broadcasting live from Wall Street. Sierra was the featured guest. She sat in the studio chair, looking impeccably groomed, radiating absolute, predatory confidence. The banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Apex Global CEO teases revolutionary neurological acquisition." I unmuted the monitor. Sierra was speaking directly to the camera, her voice smooth and practiced. She deliberately avoided specifics, masking her claims in heavy corporate jargon, but the implication was unmistakable. She strongly suggested that Apex Global had successfully secured the exclusive rights to a breakthrough plasma therapeutic. She painted a picture of absolute market dominance. We anticipate that this proprietary acquisition will increase our market valuation by approximately $4.5 billion within the next fiscal year. Sierra stated, offering a perfectly rehearsed smile to the interviewer. The stock ticker at the bottom of the screen immediately flashed green. The volume of trading spiked in real time. Institutional investors and hedge funds were reacting aggressively to her forward-looking statements. She was artificially inflating the value of her publicly traded company based entirely on stolen, fundamentally incomplete intellectual property. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute or a case of corporate espionage. Sierra had just crossed a massive legal threshold. By making false, materially misleading statements to the public market to manipulate stock prices, she had committed federal securities fraud. She had lied to the Securities and Exchange Commission, to her shareholders, and to the global market. I took a slow sip of my coffee. She had built a multi-billion-dollar house of cards on a foundation of sand, completely unaware that I controlled the tide. The sheer scale of her hubris was staggering. The trap was no longer just for a cheating, incompetent husband. It was for an entire corporate empire. If you know exactly what happens to a CEO who lies to the SEC, hit that like button. The market believed her. The bright, shadowless lights of my subterranean clean room illuminated the long stainless steel table. I didn't have weapons in the traditional sense. I didn't have explosives or firearms. I had something vastly more destructive. I had a meticulously organized, chronologically verified paper trail. I opened the heavy, fireproof filing cabinet and began laying the documents out across the sterile surface. Gavin and Sierra lived in a corporate fantasy where ideas were simply stolen and instantly monetized. They fundamentally misunderstood the physical reality of scientific innovation. An idea is entirely worthless without the irrefutable proof of its execution. I placed a thick stack of international shipping manifests on the table. They detailed the acquisition of the custom centrifuge. I had ordered the high-speed centrifugal motor from a specialized manufacturer in Munich. The cryogenic cooling jacket was custom fabricated by an aerospace firm in Kyoto. The titanium housing was milled locally in Massachusetts. Each component was purchased separately, delivered at different times, and assembled by me in this hidden facility. The most important detail was the billing address. Every single invoice, import tax receipt, and maintenance log was addressed directly to the irrevocable trust my grandfather had established. Gavin's name did not appear on a single piece of documentation. His financial footprint in this laboratory was absolutely non-existent. He had never paid for a beaker, a chemical reagent, or a kilowatt of the massive electrical draw required to run the cooling units. When you build a multi-billion-dollar biological therapeutic, the Food and Drug Administration requires an unbroken chain of custody. You must prove exactly where the materials came from, how they were processed, and who maintained the equipment. Sierra thought she could just parade the stolen formula in front of her board of directors and claim ownership. She was about to present a stolen car without a title, a registration, or the keys to turn the ignition. I ran my finger over the embossed seal of the trust documents. Justice in the modern world is rarely a dramatic confrontation in the rain. True, unassailable justice is a boring, quiet process of documentation. It is the undeniable mathematics of a bank transfer. It is a forensic audit that leaves no room for manipulation, gaslighting, or corporate spin. Sierra had built a narrative based on aggressive PR and market manipulation. I had built a fortress based on verified accounting. I stacked the invoices neatly, aligning the edges. The truth was securely bound in paper. The paper trail was absolute. I was carefully logging the latest temperature fluctuations in the cryogenic storage when my encrypted mobile device vibrated on the console. It was a secure, routed call from Dr. Harold at the Pediatric Oncology Center. I stripped off my latex gloves and answered. His voice sounded different today. The usual heavy exhaustion that coated his words was entirely gone. He sounded almost breathless. "Madeline!" "Doctor," Harold said. The background noise of the hospital faintly echoing behind him. "I just received the secondary MRI results for little Noah. I had the radiologist run the scans 3 separate times just to be absolutely certain I wasn't hallucinating." "Tell me," I said, quietly, feeling a sudden, intense stillness settle over my mind. "The extraction is a complete success," he whispered, his voice cracking with suppressed emotion. "The aggressive cellular division hasn't just halted. The primary tumor mass has shrunk by an astonishing 22% in less than a month. Madeline, the boy is actively recovering. He ate a full breakfast this morning. He walked down the hallway. A profound wave of validation washed through me. The decade of isolation, the endless failed trials, the quiet humiliation of living with Gavin's constant belittlement, it all dissolved in the face of this singular truth. The therapeutic worked. We were actually saving Noah's life. But before I could fully process the victory, "Doctor," Harold's tone shifted, dropping into a low, anxious register. "There is a complication. However," he continued, 2 corporate attorneys from Apex Global arrived at the hospital administration office an hour ago. They are aggressively pushing to acquire the anonymized data from our compassionate use program. Sierra is apparently leveraging her inflated stock valuation to offer the hospital a massive, unrestricted research grant. My grip tightened around the edge of the stainless steel table. Sierra wasn't satisfied with stealing the incomplete formula. She was actively trying to buy the clinical proof to legitimize her fraud. She wanted to slap the Apex Global logo onto Noah's survival and sell it to the highest bidder on Wall Street. She wanted to turn his beating heart into a corporate dividend. They don't have the names. Doctor, Harold assured me, the ethics board protocol is holding firm, but Sierra has incredibly deep pockets. Madeline, eventually, the hospital administrators might succumb to the financial pressure. I looked at the secure monitor displaying the network logs. I looked at the red folder containing the absolute destruction of Sierra's career. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, surgical clarity. It was time to permanently sever her influence. Stall them for exactly 24 hours, Doctor, I said calmly. Apex Global is about to experience a catastrophic liquidity crisis. I had to stop her. I did not go to the police. I did not go to the media. When you are dealing with a billionaire CEO who thrives on public relations warfare, launching a public attack only gives them a platform to countersue and deflect. I needed to execute this demolition inside her own house, in front of the people who held the strings to her power. I needed to speak to the money. I arranged a discreet, late-night meeting with Grace, the senior litigation partner who managed my grandfather's trust. We sat in her quiet, mahogany-paneled office overlooking the Boston Harbor. Grace was a woman who spoke exclusively in legal precedents and risk assessments. I placed the bright red folder on her polished desk. I need to utilize the trust's proxy shares, I told her, my voice perfectly level. Apex Global is holding an emergency shareholder briefing tomorrow morning at 8. I intend to be in the room. Grace opened the folder. She meticulously reviewed the $100,000 check featuring Gavin's blue ink memo. She examined the digital watermark logs, proving the exact time of the internal data theft. Finally, she read the intercepted spreadsheet from Sierra's own chief financial officer, detailing the blatant corporate bribery funneled through Gavin's newly registered shell company. Grace did not gasp. She didn't offer dramatic commentary. She simply adjusted her reading glasses and cross-referenced the dates on the prenuptial agreement. When she finally looked up, there was a sharp, dangerous glint in her eyes. It was the look of a master chess player recognizing an inescapable mate in 3 moves. Sierra has publicly claimed ownership of this therapeutic to inflate her stock price, Grace stated, summarizing the legal reality. By presenting these documents to her board of directors, you are not merely accusing her of intellectual property theft. You are exposing massive, undeniable SEC violations. You are proving that she defrauded her investors and misused corporate funds to bribe a low-level employee. Exactly, I replied. I want her removed from the board, and I want the legal threat to my clinical trials permanently neutralized. Grace closed the red folder, tapping it once against the desk. The trust holds a minor, but legally significant, block of preferred voting shares in Apex Global through a holding company. It grants you absolute, undeniable access to the emergency briefing tomorrow. Sierra cannot legally have security remove you from the premises. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my tailored trousers. The anxiety that had plagued me for the past 5 years was completely gone. I wasn't the quiet, insignificant wife anymore. I was the architect of my own destiny, and I was holding the detonator. If you are ready for the ultimate boardroom checkmate, type checkmate in the comments. The weapon was fully loaded. The executive boardroom of Apex Global was a monument to corporate intimidation. Situated on the 40th floor of their glass and steel headquarters, it featured panoramic views of the city skyline and a massive, polished obsidian table. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the room was packed with the company's elite. The board of directors, senior vice presidents, and key institutional investors were all seated, sipping imported mineral water. Sierra stood at the head of the table, dressed in a sharp, slate-grey designer suit. She was radiating the synthetic, aggressive confidence that had made her a billionaire. She was currently flipping through a sleek digital presentation, aggressively hyping the revolutionary acquisition that would supposedly secure Apex Global's dominance for the next decade. Sitting in the back row, positioned against the glass wall like a proud, obedient lapdog, was Gavin. He was wearing a new, ill-fitting suit he had clearly purchased to look wealthy. He was practically vibrating with unearned pride, genuinely believing he was the mastermind who had facilitated this multi-billion-dollar triumph. He thought he belonged in that room. I walked past the executive assistant's desk without breaking my stride. 2 large security guards in dark suits moved to intercept me at the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I didn't pause. I smoothly handed the lead guard a heavy, notarized proxy access document embossed with the seal of a major institutional holding firm. The guard frowned, read the first paragraph, and immediately stepped aside. Legal authority always trumps physical intimidation. I pushed the heavy glass doors open. The quiet click of the latch echoed loudly over the sound of Sierra's presentation. I walked into the room, my posture perfectly straight, carrying nothing but the red folder. I didn't storm in. I didn't shout. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. Sierra stopped mid-sentence. Her laser pointer hovered uselessly over a projection of a cellular model. She stared at me, a brief flash of genuine confusion crossing her perfectly contoured face. She had never actually met me, but she had undoubtedly seen photographs. Gavin, sitting in the back, physically jolted. The smug, self-satisfied grin vanished from his face, replaced instantly by sheer, unadulterated panic. "Excuse me," Sierra snapped, quickly recovering her icy composure. "This is a closed executive briefing. Security will escort you out immediately." I didn't stop walking until I reached the opposite end of the long obsidian table. I placed the red folder down gently. "I am here acting as the legal proxy for the Vanguard Trust, representing a preferred voting bloc of this corporation," I said, my voice smooth, cultured, and perfectly audible in the massive room. "And I have a fiduciary duty to prevent this board from committing federal securities fraud." The room fell completely silent. A low murmur rippled through the institutional investors seated around the obsidian table. Federal securities fraud was not a phrase casually thrown around in an executive briefing. Sierra's jaw tightened. The polished, media-friendly facade cracked just a fraction of an inch, revealing the ruthless predator underneath. She glared at me, her eyes cold and calculating. "I don't know what kind of pathetic domestic stunt you are trying to pull, Madeline," Sierra sneered, intentionally using my first name to diminish my authority. She gestured toward the screen. "But you are severely out of your depth. We are finalizing the acquisition of a fully mapped biological therapeutic. It is a done deal." I offered her a slow, clinical smile. "You haven't acquired a therapeutic Sierra, I replied smoothly, you have acquired a highly detailed map of a graveyard. I reached into the red folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a comparative thermal degradation curve. I slid it across the sleek black table toward the chairman of the board, a stoic man with silver hair. The files your administrative contact stole from my secondary server contain the basic chemical architecture. I explained to the room, speaking with the precise, measured cadence of a university lecture. However, in advanced biologics, the formula is entirely useless without the proprietary extraction methodology. The specific centrifugal gradients, the exact timing of the thermal shocks that is the trade secret. It is not written down on any server. It exists solely in my mind. Sierra scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss the technicality. My team of chemists can reverse engineer the process within a month. The hard part is already done. Your chemists are currently producing toxic sludge, I corrected her gently, watching the colour slowly drain from her face. If you attempt to process those proteins without my customized filtration mesh, the molecular bonds shatter instantly at room temperature. You don't have a drug. You have a highly volatile, completely unscalable chemical corpse. You have absolutely nothing. The chairman of the board picked up the paper, examining the thermal charts. He was not a scientist, but he understood the concept of a worthless asset. He looked up at Sierra, his expression shifting from supportive to deeply skeptical. You told us the asset was fully viable, Sierra, the chairman said, his voice a low rumble of warning. You authorized the press release yesterday based on the assumption of immediate scalability. Sierra shot a desperate, venomous look toward the back of the room. She looked at Gavin. She had trusted his assessment, assuming that a husband would have full access to his wife's work. She had vastly overestimated his intelligence and severely underestimated my security protocols. She had bought a lie. The billion-dollar asset died. The heavy silence in the Apex Global boardroom was suddenly shattered by the sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor. Gavin jumped to his feet from his position in the back row. His face was flushed a deep, panicked crimson. The cheap fabric of his new suit wrinkled awkwardly around his shoulders. He was desperately trying to salvage his fantasy of becoming a powerful corporate executive. She is lying, Gavin shouted, pointing a trembling finger across the long obsidian table. He looked frantically at Sierra, then at the chairman of the board, seeking any form of validation. We are legally married. Any intellectual property she developed in our home is a marital asset. I have every legal right to transfer that data to this company. It is half mine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match his frantic, hysterical energy. I simply opened the red folder resting in front of me and extracted 2 specific documents. I slid them smoothly down the polished surface of the table. You are referring to community property laws. Gavin, I said, my tone matching the sterile, clinical environment of my underground laboratory. A concept that was completely nullified the morning you signed our prenuptial agreement 7 years ago. Section 4, paragraph 2, explicitly designates all biological extraction research as the sole property of the Vanguard Trust. Gavin stared at the copy of the document. He recognized his own signature on the bottom line. He had been so entirely focused on the guaranteed monthly allowance section that he had completely ignored the clauses protecting my intellectual property. He had legally waived his rights to an empire for the price of a modest, Consistent paycheck. Furthermore, I continued, tapping the second piece of paper. It was a high-resolution scan of the $100,000 check he had so arrogantly dropped on my kitchen counter. This is the payment you offered me to relinquish my rights. Please note the memo line, written in your own blue ink. Payment for transfer of all plasma research notes. You explicitly documented your intent to purchase assets you just claimed you already owned. I looked directly into his panicked, wide eyes. He wasn't a corporate mastermind. He wasn't an innovator. He was a man who had sold his own integrity without reading the terms and conditions. He had blindly walked into a legal snare designed to catch much larger predators. You are not a partner, Gavin, I stated, letting the absolute reality of his situation settle over the room. You are just a low-level broker of stolen goods. And you don't even have the goods. He collapsed back into his chair, entirely defeated. He finally understood the architecture of the trap I had built around him. His fabricated world of power, prestige, and executive authority evaporated into thin air. He had traded a quiet, stable life for a mirage, and now he was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. He had nothing left. Sierra was a survivor. She had built her entire career by navigating corporate disasters and throwing subordinates to the wolves. She looked at Gavin's crumbling posture with absolute disgust, immediately calculating how to distance herself from his failure. She turned her attention back to the chairman of the board, attempting to deploy her signature, persuasive charm. This is a minor, irrelevant domestic dispute. Sierra argued smoothly, waving her hand dismissively at Gavin. The legal ownership of the formula can be negotiated in civil court. Apex Global still possesses the raw chemical architecture. We can simply outspend her in litigation until she is forced to license the process to us. It was a classic, brutal corporate strategy. Bleed the small inventor dry with endless legal fees. But I had not come to the boardroom to fight a war of attrition. I had come to execute a flawless, instantaneous demolition. You won't be funding any litigation, Sierra, I said, pulling the final, devastating document from the red folder. Because your access to corporate capital is about to be permanently revoked. I handed a thick, audited spreadsheet to the chairman. This is a direct, verified communication from your own chief financial officer. Over the past 4 months, Sierra has authorized multiple, unvetted disbursements from the Corporate Development Fund. The money was routed to an anonymous, limited liability corporation under the guise of independent consulting fees. The chairman adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. The tension in the room ratcheted up to a suffocating level. The institutional investors leaned forward, suddenly hyper-focused. That shell company is registered to my husband, I clarified, pointing toward Gavin, who was now staring at the floor. He has no scientific background. He holds no consulting credentials. These were not operational expenses. They were direct, documented bribes paid to a low-level employee to facilitate the theft of intellectual property. And Sierra used your shareholders' money to do it. Sierra's face went completely pale. The polished, untouchable CEO vanished, replaced by a woman staring directly into the abyss of federal prison. She had broken the cardinal rule of high finance. She hadn't just stolen, she had left an undeniable paper trail of embezzlement within her own accounting department. You publicly announced a $4.5 billion acquisition based on stolen, incomplete data, while simultaneously using company funds to bribe a domestic contact. The chairman summarized, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated fury. He looked at Sierra as if she were a toxic pathogen. You have exposed this entire board to catastrophic SEC investigations and massive federal fraud charges. Sierra opened her mouth to speak, to spin a new web of lies. But no words came out. The mathematical certainty of the audit trail had completely paralyzed her. Security, the chairman barked, slamming his hand down on the obsidian table. Escort Sierra out of this building immediately. Confiscate her phone and her access badges. We are convening an emergency termination vote right now. The empire began to fall. The corporate execution of Sierra was swift, but cornered predators are exceptionally dangerous. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, while Apex Global's stock was plummeting on the open market, Sierra deployed her final, most venomous strategy. She couldn't win in the boardroom, so she attempted to destroy me in the court of public opinion. My encrypted phone alerted me to a breaking news notification. Sierra's personal legal team had filed an emergency temporary restraining order in federal court, seeking to completely freeze my trust accounts and permanently padlock my underground laboratory. Simultaneously, they leaked a highly manipulated, anonymous story to a prominent medical blog. The headline was designed to incite mass hysteria, rogue scientist conducting unregulated brain cancer trials on vulnerable children in secret underground facility. She was trying to weaponize morality. She wanted the authorities to view me as a reckless, unethical monster preying on desperate families. She hoped the resulting federal raid would tie up my research for years, giving her lawyers enough leverage to force a settlement. It was a vile, brilliantly executed smear campaign. Grace, my trust attorney, called me immediately. We were scheduled for an emergency hearing before a federal judge in less than 2 hours. I didn't panic. I didn't frantically call the media to defend myself. I simply packed a sleek black briefcase and drove to the courthouse. I had anticipated this exact maneuver months ago. Inside the quiet, wood-panelled courtroom, Sierra's lawyers launched into a passionate, aggressive monologue about ethics, stolen corporate resources, and child safety. They painted a horrific picture of an unregulated basement lab. The judge turned to me, his expression stern and deeply concerned. I stood up slowly. I didn't argue with their emotional rhetoric. I opened my briefcase. I presented the judge with the fully certified, heavily vetted approval documents from an independent institutional review board, IRB. I handed him the comprehensive informed consent forms signed by Noah's parents, detailing the exact nature of the compassionate use program. Then I delivered the final blow. I submitted the complete chain of custody audit for every single piece of equipment and chemical reagent in my facility, proving irrefutably that not a single penny of Apex Global's money was involved. The lab was entirely self-funded, perfectly compliant, and ethically unassailable. The judge reviewed the documents. The aggressive narrative spun by Sierra's lawyers collapsed under the weight of empirical, verified data. The hearing lasted exactly 12 minutes. The judge slammed his gavel down, rejecting the restraining order with extreme prejudice and issuing a harsh warning to Sierra's counsel regarding perjury and malicious litigation. The false threat dissolved. Time is the ultimate equalizer in the realm of corporate warfare. 3 months after the emergency hearing, the dust had completely settled. The catastrophic implosion of Sierra's career was absolute and highly public. I sat in my sunlit study, drinking a cup of green tea, reading the latest updates on my secure tablet. Sierra had been formally indicted on multiple counts of federal securities fraud, corporate embezzlement, and deceiving institutional investors. The board of directors at Apex Global had not merely fired her. They had actively cooperated with the Securities and Exchange Commission to secure their own immunity. They handed over every server log, every financial audit, and every internal email that implicated her. She was currently being held in a federal detention center, awaiting trial. She had been stripped of her tailored designer suits, her private jets, and her suffocating aura of superiority. The woman who had casually referred to dying children as non-scalable compassion cases was now reduced to an inmate number in a sterile, concrete holding cell. There was no Maybach waiting to whisk her away. There was no team of highly paid public relations experts to spin her narrative. She was entirely isolated, trapped in a legal cage built by her own insatiable greed and profound arrogance. She had tried to steal a map to a treasure she fundamentally didn't understand, and she had driven herself directly off a cliff. The contrast between her current reality and mine was stark. While she sat in a silent, bleak room, my underground laboratory was humming with the beautiful, rhythmic sound of the custom centrifuge. The plasma extraction process was running at peak efficiency. We were steadily producing enough therapeutic material to sustain the expanded compassionate use program. I didn't feel a sense of vindictive joy regarding Sierra's incarceration. I felt a quiet, profound sense of order being restored to the universe. The system had functioned exactly as it was designed to. The paper trail had done its job. The relentless, meticulous documentation of truth had successfully neutralized a predator who believed she was entirely above the law. She thought the world was a chessboard where she controlled all the pieces. She never realized that I owned the board itself. She was simply playing a game with rules she didn't fully comprehend. She was finally alone. While Sierra faced the wrath of the federal government, Gavin faced a much quieter, but equally devastating annihilation. His downfall wasn't televised. It was a slow, pathetic descent into absolute irrelevance. He had been immediately terminated from his administrative job following the revelation of his data breach. He had expected Sierra to protect him. He thought their clandestine hotel meetings meant he was a valued partner in her empire. He learned the harsh reality during her preliminary hearings. Her defense attorneys actively threw him under the bus, explicitly referring to him in court documents as a rogue, low-level internal contact who had acted entirely on his own volition to extort the company. Sierra had completely erased him from her narrative. With his reputation in the pharmaceutical industry permanently destroyed, and his bank accounts frozen due to the ongoing fraud investigation, Gavin was entirely destitute. The Vanguard Trust, acting on my strict instructions, had formally initiated divorce proceedings and legally evicted him from the property. It was raining heavily on a Tuesday afternoon when the security perimeter alarm chimed in my lab. I pulled up the external camera feed. Gavin was standing outside the heavy steel gates of the old warehouse. He was soaking wet, wearing a wrinkled jacket, looking incredibly small and frail. He pressed the intercom button, his voice cracking with desperation. "Madeline, please," Gavin begged through the static of the speaker. "I have nowhere else to go. My accounts are frozen. The lawyers took everything. Please, I am your husband. We can fix this. I know I made a mistake." He was still trying to leverage a relationship that he had systematically destroyed. He was still hoping that my old habit of shielding him from his own failures would somehow save him. I looked at the screen. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity. The emotional tether had been completely severed the moment I saw him hand over the stolen files. I pressed the microphone button on my console. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You are not my partner, Gavin," I stated clearly into the microphone. "You never were. You were simply a patched vulnerability in my security protocol. Do not return to this property." I released the button and completely disabled the exterior intercom system. I watched on the monitor as he stood in the rain for several long minutes, slowly realizing that the protective umbrella I had held over him for years was gone forever. He turned and walked away into the grey afternoon. The steel gate closed. The true victory was never about destroying Gavin or incarcerating Sierra. Those were merely necessary administrative tasks required to protect the real objective. The ultimate validation of my life's work arrived on a bright, crisp Tuesday morning in the sunlit living room situated above the underground laboratory. I was sitting on the reclaimed oak sofa, reviewing a finalized legal contract. Doctor Harold sat across from me, sipping a cup of hot Darjeeling tea. The heavy oak door to the study opened, and a nurse walked in, holding the hand of a little boy. It was Noah. He looked profoundly different from the fragile, translucent child I had seen through the observation glass months ago. His hair was beginning to grow back in soft, dark patches. The dark, sunken circles under his eyes had completely vanished. He was wearing a brand new pair of bright red sneakers. Noah let go of the nurse's hand. He stood on his own, with slow, deliberate, and entirely miraculous steps. He walked across the hardwood floor toward Dr. Harold. He didn't stumble. The aggressive neurological deterioration had not just been halted, the extraction process had actively allowed his body to begin repairing the damage. I watched the little boy smile and high-five the old doctor. A profound, overwhelming warmth bloomed in my chest. This was the empire I had built. It wasn't measured in billions of dollars or corporate press releases. It was measured in the steady rhythm of a child's footsteps. I looked down at the contract resting on my lap. It was a highly complex, bulletproof distribution agreement with an international non-profit medical consortium. The Vanguard Trust was officially licensing the therapeutic plasma treatment for global distribution. The pricing structure was locked at absolute cost, guaranteeing that no family would ever be priced out of survival by corporate greed. However, the contract contained one critical caveat. I was licensing the final product, but I was strictly retaining the intellectual property of the trade secret. The precise centrifugal parameters and the thermal shock sequencing would remain securely air-gapped in my subterranean fortress. I would maintain absolute control over the manufacturing protocol. I picked up a titanium pen and signed my name on the bottom line. The formula would save lives, but the keys to the kingdom would remain forever in the dark, safe from the predatory hands of the open market. I looked up and caught Noah's eye. The little boy smiled. I stood alone in the center of the GMP clean room, the shadowless lights casting a pristine glow over the stainless steel surfaces. The massive biological extraction unit was humming quietly, preparing for the next cycle. The air smelled faintly of ozone and absolute sterilization. The chaos of the past year had been completely neutralized, leaving behind a profound, unshakable tranquility. Thieves like Gavin and corporate predators like Sierra share a fundamental flaw in their psychology. They are entirely obsessed with the final product. They desire the wealth, the prestige, and the finished masterpiece. They look at a soaring skyscraper and try to steal the keys to the penthouse, completely ignoring the fact that the true value lies in the deep, invisible foundation. They thought they could steal a chemical formula and instantly replicate a decade of grueling, isolated perseverance. They failed to understand that the magic isn't in the ingredients. It is in the agonizing, repetitive, and deeply private process of creation. They stole a map, but they lacked the discipline to walk the path. I had built my life exactly the way I built my laboratory layer by meticulous layer, securing every vulnerability and documenting every single truth. When they tried to burn my world down, they didn't realize they were standing in a room devoid of oxygen, trying to strike a match, the legal documents, the audit trails, the invisible watermarks. They were simply the architecture of my defense. The real weapon was the quiet, dignified silence of knowing my exact worth. I didn't need to scream to prove I was powerful. I didn't need to destroy their lives with malice. I merely needed to step aside and let them be crushed by the immense weight of their own documented lies. The biological therapeutic would go out into the world, healing the vulnerable, while the process remained my permanent, untouchable sanctuary. In the world of science and survival, true power isn't in what you loudly claim to own. It's in the quiet process you master. If Madeline's brilliant checkmate inspired you, share this story, subscribe, and never let anyone steal the process of your life. See you in the next one.